Hi, welcome back to the channel. In the past, I've done quite a few videos on grain plugins or plugins that have the grain function in them somewhere, and every single time the comments are filled with, yeah, it's good, but it's no Crusher X. And to be honest, I had no experience of Crusher X, so I couldn't comment. So I thought it was about time to get it in and have a look at it. Now let's get the elephant out of the room first. It's not cheap. However, for the next 15 or so minutes, put that aside and I'll come back and discuss it in the conclusion. For now though, let's just focus objectively on the features and sound. Now the interface does look extremely intimidating, and to be honest, this video has taken me quite a long time to prepare, mainly for two reasons. One, because of the complexity, and two, just because I keep on getting lost. I go and explore a new function, and I get lost playing with that function for half an hour, forgetting I'm meant to be recording. Now the interface, as I said, does look incredibly intimidating, however it is also very logically laid out. So basically think of it, split the interface into two halves, so we have the left and the right, and basically everything on the left is where you edit, and then everything on the right is essentially visualization. So first up, let's look at this knob in the middle, which is the number of grain generators, and it's quite self-explanatory in that it is literally the number of grains. So currently we're set to 1, and this can go anywhere from 1 to 199, and if we start to turn this up, we will see here in the modulation section, this little bar increase the number of highlighted rows. So the reason for showing this first is because when I start to explain this modulation section, then you understand what this bar is representing. And then similarly also on this graph here, but I'll explain that further in a moment. So let's turn this back down to 1. And now let's have a look at this graph here. So we have 3 axes. We have the x-axis, which shows the length of the grains. So here the first grain is basically 22.5 milliseconds, or shortly under. The y-axis is the number of grains, so you might have seen this increase when we turned this up earlier. So if we go to 2, now we have 2 rows, 3 and 4 because we're increasing the number of grains. Now don't get confused with these 3 that trail. These are visualizations of the repeated grain, if that makes sense. So let's go down to 1, just so easy to display. We have this grain which is actually triggered, and then it shows the previous 3 grains that were triggered prior to this single grain. So we go up to 2, we have still only 2 grains, but then the previous 3 grains of each. And then on the z-axis, we have the delay of each grain, which I'll explain further in a moment. So now you know what you're looking at with this visualization and also the number of grains. Let's have a look at the modulators in depth. Now the first one, delay, and this determines, well, the delay between the audio input into the buffer and the grain output. So if we increase this via the offset, we will see these grains move further back along the z-axis here, like so. So now we're pushing them back or bringing them forward in time. Currently this is set to a fixed offset, in this case 63 milliseconds. However, we can also modulate that with this parameter here. This is the depth, and then let's turn the frequency up, and we can see the modulation like so. Let's turn the number of grains up. Obviously quite basic at the moment, but that will surely change as we progress through. Now modulation determines the modulation depth, and then frequency determines the rate of the modulation. So it's very slow, or we can turn it up. Spread determines the modulation between each grain. So this is best visualized if we turn it down to 2 grains, and let's turn the spread all the way down, and let's turn the phase down also. We can see now that these grains are moving exactly parallel to each other. However, if we turn the grain up, we can see the modulation now moving together or moving closer, and then it will move further apart, like so. So spread is essentially the constant moving delta between these 2 grains. Let's turn the spread down so now we can visualize phase. And phase is quite similar in that it modulates the difference in phase between each grain. So once again, if we turn this up, we can see each grain move slowly in and out of phase with each other. To the right of that, we have the modulation options. So currently this is set to sine as displayed here and also displayed in this graph here. We have several different options here. I'm not going to go through all of these, but we have the usual suspects such as sine and triangle and all the common waveforms, as well as some randomization options. The XY field, which I'll explain in a moment, which is amazing. And then we have different options such as spline, steps, ADSR, envelope follows, etc. And some of these, if we click on spline, for example, then we look down here, then we have a spline curve that can be adjusted. And then similarly for steps, we have a little step designer thing here. Similarly, we have an envelope follower, a sidechain envelope follower. Then moving on to the right, we have a button to bring up that modulation. So for example, if I move off this envelope follower and click on this one, I can now return to that sidechain envelope by clicking this editor here like so. If we go back to one of the waves, so sine, let's say, then we can have it free running or tempo synced. We can change the curve or we can invert the modulation. That's quite a bit of time I spent on the delay, and that's because a lot of this functionality is replicated on the additional tabs. So the remaining ones will be far quicker. One thing I failed to mention was the randomization here. So we can click on this and basically just go crazy. It will randomize all the parameters that we just set up. We can do it again. So this is quite a lot of fun if you're running out of ideas, just want some inspiration, you can click on this randomization and wow, who knows what will happen. But now we can go back, we can undo. Let's go back to how I had it, which was this one, I think. Now let's move over to the next one, which is length. So this is grain length. And once again, this one is quite self-explanatory in that it is the length of the grain. So if we adjust this offset, then you can see this grain length increase, or we can turn it all the way down so we have a very short grain. And obviously it goes without saying, we can modulate that, we can increase the rate of modulation, and once again, we can spread that modulation between the two, in this case, grains, and we can do change in phase between each of those grains. So like I said earlier, everything from mod to the right is replicated on the first 7 tabs. Let's listen to something. And we're only here on 2 grains. Let's turn this up. Really sounds amazing. And don't forget, these parameters I've really just been modifying randomly to show you, and even still it sounds just fantastic. Let's move on now to the next tab, which is the birth rate, and this determines the rate of each newborn grain. So essentially by adjusting the birth rate and the length of each grain, this determines the grain density. So for higher densities, we want longer grain lengths and shorter birth times. And as you can see here visually, it's already quite dense. But let's have a listen. And then we can reduce the birth rate. And you can hear instantly it's a lot less dense. Or let's go the other way and go fully crazy. As you expect, we can then modulate that. Now moving on to the offset, and this is the time it takes for each grain to be processed. So if we look at this y-axis here, and then we increase the offset, we will see these grains move further away from this y-axis, basically along the x-axis. So now we can see them shifting away. Let's turn down the modulation so that makes it a bit more visible. There we go, mostly down, and then we'll just put it back down to 1 and back down to offset. Currently this is set to 907 milliseconds, so almost a second, but we can bring them down so now they're flush against the y-axis, so they're processed immediately. But like I said, we can add a bit of delay there. Next we have grain life, and once again this is another quite self-explanatory parameter. This is the time that each grain stays active. Next we have speed, and this is really the pitch of the grain. So 1 being the default, however if we increase it to 2, then this is double the pitch. And once again this can be modulated or spread. Let's just put this on as sine. Now next up we have sweep. This is also pitch shifting, but over the life cycle of the grain. So positive values will increase the speed over the grain's life cycle, and negative values decrease the pitch over the life cycle. Now for the keen-eyed among you, you will notice that this icon looks identical to this icon, and that's because they're directly related. So if we were to click on this, then we have the modulation curve for that sweeping modulator. So we can increase it so it comes on very, very quick, and then we can draw in a little tail at the end, or basically do whatever we want. Then we can adjust the modulation here. So now let's keep on moving ahead. And I realize I'm moving through this quite quickly, but there is so much to discuss. If I was to go through in depth, the video would literally be 4 hours long. So now let's look at GCO mix, the first of 3 grain controlled oscillator tabs. So here we have mix, pitch, and wave. Staying on mix for the moment, if we go down here to the middle and we click on this little DCO option, we can now, as you can see, we can load up 8 different either oscillators or audio files to play alongside the grains. So mix determines the balance between the output of the oscillator and the grain itself. Pitch determines obviously the pitch of the oscillator. And you can obviously hear that quite clearly there. I'm going to come to this in my conclusion, but if you want horror-like soundscapes, then as you can hear from this, I think not much comes close to this. Just absolutely fantastic, creating horror scores with just moving random knobs essentially. And then the final one, which is the wave. This either applies phase modulation if a wavetable is selected, or an oscillator is selected, or it modifies the starting point of the playback if a sample is selected. Essentially, think of this as wavetable scanning if you're familiar with really any wavetable synth. And then following that, we have 11 pages of what I would loosely call kind of further audio processing. The first one is a wave shaper for overdrive and general distortion duties, with the wave determined once again with the corresponding icon down here. Next up we have X-Crush, and this little icon actually is very representative of what's happening. So you will see we have two blocks here, so they're the two grains, then the overlapping section is filled in with the color. And that's because this effect applies a ring mod just to the overlapping sections of the grains. It's probably best to listen to this rather than trying to explain. So you've got that kind of gritty, bubbly-like texture at the start of each grain. Probably something it's a really excellent sounding effect, but I would probably put it somewhat in moderation and then modulate it so it only happens every now and again. Or go crazy with it, up to you. Next we have Bit Crush, which is quite self-explanatory. It does feature a range from 12 bits down to 1 bit. So at 0 it's obviously off. At 1%, this is get 12 bits. And then we increase that to 100% where it gets down to completely nasty 1 bit. Just awesome. Let's turn that down, and then moving on we have the filter, and here we have several modes. I think my favorite is probably the formants mode, with the vowels very conveniently listed to the right there. Now I said before about making horror sounds, and it just doesn't get better than adding this formants filter to getting kind of monster horror-like sounds. To the right of that we have the resonance for the filter. Next up we have volume, which is obviously self-explanatory. Then we have pan, again self-explanatory. However, one completely mind-blowing feature of this is the ability to pan individual grains. And one thing I failed to mention right at the very start is that this allows not just stereo, but full surround sound processing. So imagine having these effects going with panning all around the room for each grain. If I had a full Atmos setup, I don't think I would ever leave the studio. It would just sound absolutely immense. Next we have feedback modulation, and this determines the amount that each grain is fed back into the feedback bus. So really useful for reverb type effects or basically just long drones. Getting a bit gritty there. Let's turn down some of the ring mod. And a lot of it is really just happy accidents sometimes. That little bubbly, gurgly monster thing, I love that. There, oh, awesome. Now the next one, the auxiliary bus, and this is another awesome feature. You're able to bypass individual grains from the processing and then send them to an auxiliary bus. So then you can have part of the grains being modulated by external plugins and then the remaining part to be modulated by Crusher X. So just consider how much flexibility that offers and the sound design possibilities of that, just absolutely mind-blowing. Next we have diffuse, and diffuse essentially applies a reverb to each grain before it does any processing. And once again, it's probably best to listen to this rather than trying to explain it. Let's turn down the feedback. Awesome. Next we have tilt, and this allows each grain to be processed with different grain windows. Let's have a listen to that. We'll turn off the previous diffuse. Oh, this is really good. Like I said at the start, I'm getting lost once again. Now let's move on to the middle section, and I'm going to hopefully skip through this quite quickly because I realize that the video is already quite long. First up, we have visualization of all of these parameters above. So here, let's go to offset, and then if we increase the number of grain generators, you can see that this section increases in the number of blue rows. So let's turn it all the way up to make it a bit more visual. Now you can see here, these are moving, these light blue are slowly moving. And you might have already realized that this is the modulation of each. So let's look at this delay. We can see we have a sine wave modulating the delay. So let's now turn the modulation up. Let's turn it quite high. And now we can see the modulation curve, essentially this modulation curve, being replicated here. And let's do the same for length. Let's just put this one on. I'm just going to do random each grain, turn it up. And then once again, you can see this modulation being reflected there. So basically, this is a really high-level overview of the modulations, even if you're not on one of these pages. So you can be, for example, on the bit crushing section, and then you can still view the modulations here. And then below that, we have what's called the adore parameters. Now consider these as essentially pre-mapped macros. However, you can edit them should you wish, but each one of these is assigned to a handful of parameters. Now to show this, I've just skipped over to another preset, just another one at random, just so I can show a bit more variation in the sound. And then as I play this back, I will adjust some of these, as I said, predefined macro parameters. So we have spice. Groove. So it is quite fun changing them randomly. You never know what you're going to get. I think I'm inadvertently quoting Forrest Gump there. But should you wish to edit them yourself, you can go over to this MIDI page here, the mapping editor. Then we go to this mixer option here. Then we can change the Adore modulations. So here, for example, we can see its Spice has, let's say, maybe 15 or maybe 20 different modulations, going to Big Crush Frequency, Big Crush Mod, Oscillator Mix, so you can put them to, I think, as many as you want. And then just to round up the rest of these options, we have a macro page, so we can select anything we want here, for example, and then we can do set to macro 1, and then macro 1 controls the number of grains, and we can assign, once again, to as many as we want. So let's put this to frequency, macro 1, and now macro 1 is controlling both of those parameters. And there are 12 of those. Next we have the DCO page, which I showed earlier. And like I said earlier, you can either play waveforms like this, so sine or saw, etc., or you can load up your own sounds. Next we have an ADSR editor. So if we get down to the bottom here, we can enable ADSR mode and then edit the ADSR for each grain. To the right of that we have a trigger and glitcher. So with this you can trigger each grain to be separately captured. So you can set up the frequency range of each, and then this dotted line determines the threshold for capturing that sound, if that makes sense. Next we have two global modulators. So here, in addition to the modulation above, we can have 2 pages of additional modulations. On mod 1, we currently have this to speed and then also to offset, with the modulator being sample and hold. And then this can be also assigned here to, let's say, X crush, and then the modulation amount of that. So that can be, as I said, further modulated with a sample and hold, or once again, whatever you want. An ADSR, the steps like I showed earlier. We have the second page of the global modulations. This is the sweeping modulator I showed at the start. We have the wave shaper modulator, that was up here. Next is the tilt modulator. Then we have a compressor on the outputs, also a compressor on the feedback bus. We have the envelope follower modulation, which we can determine up here, like I said. If we select input envelope follower, we have the sidechain envelope follower, and then moving on to one of my favorite features of this entire plugin, and there are many favorite features. We have the ability to morph between different parameter selections and also different preset selections, with the range possible between 1/100th of a second to 1 hour. And yes, you heard that right, 1 hour. And then the modulation of that is determined by this morphing slope here. So for example, we're currently on Glitcher X preset, and let's turn this speed up. Let's turn it to 21 seconds, and I'll play back a sound, and then I will switch presets, and the sounds will morph from one preset to the next over a duration of 22 seconds. So it's starting to come up now. You can hear the change. And now we're into the Alien Crank preset. I just find that the most amazing feature on any plugin ever. Next we have a quantization mode setting, and I'm going to skip over this as well as the next two, just so I can get to, again, one of my most favorite features. So here you have the different macro assignments and MIDI CC assignments, and then the last page is the master global settings. But like I said, I want to skip over those because they're all relatively self-explanatory, and I want to skip over to this, what looks like an XY pad here. Now, this is far from an XY pad. So this dot here, think of this as a ball, and this is a bowl. So if we zoom all the way out, you can now start to see the circle of the bowl, and also what looks like the shading to indicate the depth of this bowl. So what would happen if we dropped a ball into a bowl? It would circle around this bowl and it would always get back to this center point. So let's change the speed of the ball, and then we'll move something around like that. And you can see it slowly gets back into the center. Let's do the same. Let's move it up a bit. Moves around that bowl exactly as it would in real life. Moves back and forward, and eventually it would get back into the center. But let's say that's too much modulation. Well, we can flatten out that bowl by moving this down. So now with the lines perfectly vertical and horizontal, this is a flat surface now. So if I move something out like that, my ball stays exactly where I left it because we're on a flat surface. Or we have a shallow bowl, so it still goes down to the center, but at a slower speed. And really, I've never seen a modulation like this. This is just so much fun. Now let's hear some presets because there's been a lot of talking. This is all the same source sound, by the way. That just sounds absolutely immense. Once again, same source sound, but not even close. Let's have a look at what else we have. Well, loads, but let's change it to scanner perhaps. Just awesome. And like you saw there are hundreds of presets. It's only time to go through just a fraction of them. So what's my conclusion then? Like I said at the start, it isn't cheap, but I want to draw a distinction between a lot of money and value for money. Now, if you're a bedroom producer or just a hobbyist or something like that, then there are probably other grain plugins that would suit your needs. But if you do this for a living and you want the absolute best granular plugin, and when I say best, there is nothing that comes close, not even anywhere near this, then this is the ticket. It has absolutely blown my mind from day one. So if your music requires a lot of granular glitching sound, then it doesn't get better than this. Or if you're doing film scoring and you need these kind of sounds, then again, it doesn't get better than this. And if you spent this much money on a plugin, it would absolutely be worth the investment. And for those who are thinking, oh, I might wait for a Black Friday sale, one thing I must completely commend the developer for, he does not do sales. He's of the firm belief that his plugin is worth the money, and absolute respect for that, and therefore does not do sales. And part of the reason for that, and there's a big section on the website about this, is because it mentions the decline of the plugin industry. And I've been talking about this for quite a long time. The best pricing model I've ever seen is the one from Valhalla. His plugins are $50, no sales, no discounts, ever. And I really don't think Sean from Valhalla is short of a penny as a result. And also, if you look at all the companies that are truly pushing the boundaries, all the ones that are truly innovative, I noticed a trend. These are the ones who don't have sales. And here I'm talking about Yuhi. So obviously there's been occasional, maybe once every couple of years, there's a 50% off, but they are very few and far between. Serum from Expert doesn't have sales, and that's probably the number one synth plugin out there. Polyverse have the occasional sale, maybe a beta introductory sale, but after that, it normally stays fixed price. And then you compare that to other companies, who I'm not going to name, but you know the ones. They're the ones that every single day you get a $29.95 offer. These are the companies that are constantly putting out, I'm going to be honest here, just garbage. They are plugins that you buy and you completely forget about the next day. Because if you're only receiving 30 euros for a plugin, where's the motivation to truly innovate? You're just going to keep on pumping out the same old crap just to get the next sale. Don't get me wrong, I'm clearly not a millionaire, so I do enjoy cheap plugins, but I also do fear for the future of the industry when everything is so cheaply priced. It is very much a race to the bottom in this industry. And for that reason, I absolutely must commend Axone for not going down that path. So like I said, just to recap, if you want the absolute best there is, nothing comes even remotely close to this. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.